I want to talk about the Fire Risk Assessor Working Group 4, but the point before I get into that is really a bit of background that underlies, I think, a big thing that we haven't touched on yet, which is about culture. We've talked about behaviour, but I think there's a lot to do with culture. Culture, both within the building sector, if you like to call it, the construction sector, and within the wider general public. This perception of how people see fire and what they think fire is. Everyone seems to think it's well boxed off, it's manageable, it's all dealt with, it's very easy to understand, and it is to a point. It is a process, it's a very defined process, you can learn it, it's a chemical process, it has certain behavioural traits, and therefore you can be taught it and you can learn it. And some of you did as Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and so on, and have carried that through, I hope, some of you. But risk assessment, as part of that process, I think is misunderstood, and I'll explain that a little bit as well, in the sense that we know what risk assessment is about. We understand it mainly, a lot of people do, from their health and safety and all those sorts of things. But in reality, risk assessment within fire requires a basic understanding of fire safety. And that, I think, is a key to this. And in terms of, we were asked to personalise where we are. 40 years ago, the thread that seems to have run this morning with a few of the speakers, 40 years ago, in Manchester, a great northern city, 10 people died in a Woolworths store. Just remember that. And those things are going on, and they're constantly going on. And we thought we'd boxed it off then. We thought we got it in the box well and truly then. And then we brought in some good law. It's been touched on a few times in 206, the Fire Safety Order. But still we have problems with this quality of things. Frequent fires are happening. The big ones that happened this August have been mentioned. So there's a poor understanding in the background of all this. And in some cases, and again I think it's cropped up in part of the conversation, a lot of what you do now is seen as tick box. People just have to tick a box and move it on. Tick a box, move it on. Culture. That's the message for me that comes out of that. It isn't about ticking boxes. And that very, very, very much is where the Fire Risk Assessor Group started from. The sad thing is, the good trends that have come from the actions that have been taken by groups like the Fire and Rescue Service, who've gone in and done education at school level and so on, the declining deaths of smoke detectors in the home, all those sorts of things created a complacency in many of our views. And if you're not safe in your home, she's not safe, Her Majesty, in her home. It runs throughout society. So, when this group got going, it started off by looking at the need to have a composite background. And these are the four main recommendations. I do suggest you read the report, because the graph on the far side over there, the pretty coloured one, is showing you that this is an assembly process of learning some fundamentals and then adding to them and adding to them. And is a framework that the Federation and a group developed and have developed over a decade or more. And it's worth looking at that. Anna, why has your Citrix receiver appeared? Have you got that? Oh, you haven't got that? Oh, I've got some. Anyway, okay. So, we first of all make the point that this is a quality process that has to be followed, and it has to be followed methodically. If you don't do that, the chances are you'll miss the obvious or you'll miss something. So those big messages were one of the very first parts of the group's recommendations. The other thing is, and I go right back to it, it underpins fire safety. It underpins fire safety. That means, and I'm in occupation, this group this afternoon is about occupation. I argue this is the beginning. It goes into design and runs right through this building until it's demolished and got rid of, and there's a parking plot. And I think that's the key part of our messaging that we wanted to get across. People have also mentioned about having qualified assessors. There are thousands of qualified fire risk assessors, it appears to be, out there. You can have them for free, or you can pay £100 and they'll come and give you something. But in reality, the real risk assessors try to meet proper standards, and those standards cost money to get. They train, they learn, they register, they're part of professional bodies like the Institution of Fire Engineers, or they're UCAS approved and go through other bodies. So the point I'm trying to make is these guys actually have put effort and money and resource into this, and they definitely need the protection of a statutory duty to make people use them. I make no bones about that. We understand from where the proposals are going, it's going to be statutory by default. In other words, the high level will take care of it. The HSE type format of the upper group will take care of a cascade downwards. I really, really worry about that, and so do many people in my industry. Teeth has been talked about. That's what we're talking about there. And the bit down on the bottom there, in case you can't read it, is the thing that many people have already said. It's about accreditation. It's about validation. It's about making sure that these people haven't just done it, but they've been watched to do it. They've come through a career progression, which is the blue chart from the bottom up. And as they've developed up that process, a question this morning, as they've developed upwards, they've been assessed. And when they get to the upper level, the stage that this group's at the moment is we're writing the standard and the assessment process for what we regard as the higher risk assessor. We haven't called them in scopes, because from our context in fire, the view is it isn't the scale of the building necessarily, it is about the occupancy, which in scope we'll pick up, but also it's about where that building is within the complexity of many structures. So you can have an underground building that has a very high risk, and we would argue that some of those buildings will not be in scope, but you need these sort of skill bases. And that is the next stage of this development. And when we've done that stage of development, we hope the people who run current registers of third-party accredited people, we hope those people will apply this across the board, and we're in those discussions now, so that the people who operate on the highest level of risk will have a common playing field across the board, and we can specify that to people who need those sorts of services. Finally, I just want to talk about the cross-sectorial issue about this. It's a well-defined process, and there's a danger if you're not careful that people will just say, well, I've got the guidance. And when the 2006 change came, the good law, as I said, the fire safety order, the government issued guidance. But it was made specifically so that it wouldn't be a consultant's charter. At the time we were going through the process of deregulation, we were going through a period when we were trying to move away from all the regulatory controls. And in doing so, I think we've actually created the sort of world that we're now living in, which we don't like. It also, as I say, has to be methodical and comprehensive. The professions need to interact very strongly with it. And this little chart on the bottom over here that I want to point to is actually drawn off the RIBA chart, but against a group of users. This work was done in 2013, so predates Grenfell. And the idea of the colours, as you obviously realise from the traffic lights, it's trying to identify where the knowledge bases were. And you can see it's a pretty poor quality picture, in that there's a lot of poor knowledge around. I don't think that's changed a lot. I really do not think that has changed a lot. And we need to get that patchy change dealt with. We really need to get this done from an educational position, ground up, through those social landlords, through those other engineering practices, so that people actually do use and understand fire safety and know what they don't know, which is the crunch of competency. It mustn't be a lottery, which is what we're trying to say here, and it is cross-sector. And I think the big message, therefore, from my group is that if you want to change this, give it some bite, give it some teeth, use the people who've made the investments, look for those quality seals, and hopefully we can start to lift the game. Thank you very much.
I'll go straight on into this. I mean, I would ask those who have the interest, it is an appendix B in the end. The detail, the devil is in the detail in this role, and I'll skim through some of it, try and give you a good idea, but this really is important that people come back to us and tell us whether this works, whether it doesn't work, and so on and so forth. So I really would ask that people go back and have a look. The building safety manager, we were charged with the idea of getting a competency framework for the building safety manager. first thing we had to do is decide who it was, where they sat within the potential environment for doing the work. It became very obvious that this was a very wide scope of role. Now, I've put down here, we've got fire safety, which is with the starter pack, but then we've also got all the health and safety, water hygiene, asbestos, and so on and so forth, which are already out there and are necessary to be done. Now, one of the issues we got, that we have worked from the beginning in looking at this as a holistic role, and that the role would be undertaken in a whole building. I'll come back to that in a little while. So the concept is one building with some residential in it, some mixed, a bit of this, a bit of that, and within it this building safety manager.
Anthony, can you hold the microphone close to your mouth?
Closer to the mouth. Can you hear me more? Yes? Better, I should say. So within the structure, we start with the building itself, which needs to have some sort of license. I mean, that's something that LMHCG has. But what we have is the buildings, and this is very important to our role in the long run, because what we tried to do with this role is to make sure it works as a model for all sorts of residential, right the way down to the 2 up, 2 down HMO down in a port or something. So we tried to build a model that would work over everything. Hence, starting with the building license, that will give us, it'll either be highly complex, we haven't gone into how you license it, but it'll be a mixture of the risk and the complexity and the height and everything else. But the point of that is you will need different levels of competence to manage different levels or heights or complexities of buildings, which is important to our role here. We have the licensed accountable person, which we know is the owner, the accountable person right at the top. We've also suggested there needs to be a residential accommodation operator. By that, we mean something like a managing agent, further down the line, a lettings agent. Because in the real world, the owner, our accountable person, will tend to subcontract out to a managing agent to manage his building. Yeah? So it sits out there at the moment. And below that, we've got the licensed safety, the building safety manager. These two, we're suggesting they need to be licensed to the extent that they're fit for purpose. They actually know they're taking on a residential building and all the added responsibility that comes around it. It's not a huge lot, but there needs to be a bit of education around it. And obviously there'll be the National Register that we've spoken about before of those. Operationally, and this is a point we're making, they'll be appointed by the accountable person, the owner, but they're likely to be employed by the residential accommodation operator, the managing agent or the letting agent or whatever the agent is. So there's a bit of a difference there. There's an appointment here and an employment here, which there might be a little bit of a conflict of interest. In addition to these, of course, we've got the residential engagement, which is half the point of all of this exercise. So you need the hard, the technical skills, you need quite a lot of soft skills in dealing with the tenant engagement. We don't believe, and I'll come back to it, that he can actually, or she can actually be responsible for all of this all of the time, and we believe government has a role to play, and which I'll come back to in a little while. Of course, as I said, we are assuming in our model that we've got a nice sparkling new building that's been given to us. It all works, we've got it all digitally, it's guaranteed, it's signed off. We've also, of course, got the existing stock, which we're not in that position. So there are two very different sort of levels of building that this person's going to have to deal with. So what we're saying is they cannot possibly be, competent to be an expert in all of this, but they have to be confident and competent enough to take on experts, to give them advice, but they need to know enough to question that advice and ask for the correct advice, if that makes sense to people. And we're seeing this license run rather like a driving license, because linked to this, the size and complexity of the building, you're going to need different levels of competence for the building safety manager over years. Coming to the competencies, it's been spoken about before. We've made a diagram here, but we've got residence occupier safety right in the middle of it. That's the important bit. Round the outside, or right and round the middle, are the competencies they need to undertake and understand. But pulling all that together is behaviours. It's been referred to a number of times today. Excuse me. But you can teach anybody, you can learn anything very much, but behaviours are wrong, you're going nowhere. So one of the things we're having difficulty or having a look at is actually, while we're building these into the common format for the standard for the competencies, is looking at how we measure behaviours. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's there needs to be a code of conduct. We're suggesting they probably have to go through the whole process every 3 years to make sure that they're still competent, and it's tested, and the licence will be held by the Competence Committee. So finally, I get to the recommendations, and this is a summary of quite a number. But basically, it's a senior position. As Scott said this morning, it needs to be a senior leader. These are not the term used now. We've got a building manager, facilities managers, we've got property managers, we've got fire safety people, we've got engineers. This role takes a little bit of all of that. And at this moment at the time, we don't believe anyone's got all of those roles. So we've got to be able to pull that together. It needs a bit of time. But it's a senior position, competent, and the most important thing is confident. And that will probably come to a certain amount of experience and competence. Resubmission every 3 years. The building safety regulator for the registers of these APs and the residential accommodation operators. Again, we believe these are important. At the moment in the government's consultation document that's come out, the point of the RAO has been missed. It isn't mentioned. So we are carrying on lobbying for that, and we're very interested in people's view once you've had a look at our thing and responded to it. But we think it's very, very important. Other matters that are outstanding is reasonable and proportionate access, because it's very hard to operate a residential building if you can't get into the units. Now, we've got to be proportionate, it's got to be reasonable, but we've got to have better and easier access than having to go through the courts every time. So I need my glasses now. Safety case and fire and emergency file. There are further working parties working for that. This golden thread is fundamentally the backbone of what this person's going to receive. A lot of us will know that out there at the moment, the common, a number of the buildings that are in existence do not have the accurate information. So we've got to go out and get that, and that's a big issue. That's a big issue. And a residency engagement, as I said, I'll come back to that. We believe that we should have, rather like drink driving, for those who remember that, clunk click, all these sorts of things, we need public sector broadcasting over the next 10 years to try and get the culture of people living in their own accommodation to take a certain amount of understanding of what fire safety means and what their contribution to it is. You know, we have to get this concept that they are responsible for their own safety as well. It's not suggesting everybody else isn't, but we believe that actually if this started now for 10 years and it went into the WI, went into schools, went into scouts, over the next 10 years, the culture of residents might be a lot better with regard to fire safety and with access to various things and so on and so forth. So we believe that's very important. We've got a couple of things that are outstanding, not least definitions. I mentioned whole building. At some point we've been told that actually the scope of this role might only be, or the legislation might only be residential elements of a building. So if you've got a mixed use, that's out with. We don't believe that should be right. It has to be the whole building, otherwise this doesn't work. Definition of a thing like a fire strategy, it's a little personal bugbear of mine. There's no definition of a fire strategy, or if there are dozens of them. And I would suggest, and I would ask, how a fire risk assessor can actually take a fundamental, decent assessment of a building if he doesn't know what the strategy is. And that's on the assumption there is a strategy in the building, which there frequently isn't. Insurability, we have been tasked with and are discussing matters with the insurance industry about whether this role and how this role is best insured. And it seems probable that it fits in with our structure of the RAO or being within the cover of an organisation. So I'll finish up by asking you all to read the detail and then give us your answers. Thank you very much.
Morning everybody, just a quick introduction to me, George Adams, President of SPIE. I'm a practicing engineer. I still practice today despite the grey hairs. Sorry, I am a practicing engineer, I do practice today. And why do I have credibility to speak to you? Yes, I do get involved in large residential buildings. I refurbish them, I put the engineering in, and believe me, and I'm going to just delve a little bit in here, when I go and look at buildings that exist, I find all sorts of problems. Fire systems that don't work properly, fire compartments that are breached, systems that are not maintained properly, maintenance teams that don't understand the systems that they're operating. I find all sorts of issues like that. I even find systems that have been switched off, okay? So when we look at the maintenance, and I'm reversing my order now because I think I need to get this message across to you. We talk a lot about competence, and what we're doing in this forum and what we're doing in the working groups is an amazing step forward for our industry in terms of competence. The competence of a maintenance manager and an engineer is so important. We throw documents at them, drawings at them, schedules at them. Do those people understand how to read those documents? Do they understand how to interpret them? Has anybody trained them on how all the life safety systems in a high-rise building actually works in relationship to the documents they're working from? And by the way, the maintenance contractor can change every 3 years and you get a whole bunch of new people turn up. That leads me into where our engineering group got to was the need to learn from other industries, and we did. So what we did is we engaged and we found a safety case process. The safety case process that we focused on was called the bow tie process. It comes from the oil and gas industry. It's not the only type of process. What we then did is we engaged with end users, 4 major end users in London who operate and own high-rise buildings of a substantial nature. The working groups we had with those end users was absolutely fantastic, brilliant input from them, total support for the need for a safety case process, working of course with the safety case. But what they saw for the safety case process was the point I just raised about when people change, and they change frequently. And it gives them an opportunity to create a process that goes from beginning to end, and when people come in and change, they can go into the safety process and go, okay, that's where everything sits, that's the document structure, and that's where all my risks are, and there's my residual risk schedules. We then figured out that actually one of the problems within that is that a lot of the people that design, build and operate high-rise buildings actually often don't understand the importance of how all the life safety systems have technical interfaces. How do those technical interfaces all work? And here's the reason why. Because it's one time all those complex systems need to work, and that's the time at which people have got to escape from a fire. And if the lighting system doesn't work, the smoke ventilation system doesn't work, when the fire alarm goes off and it doesn't bring on the smoke ventilation system. These are issues that have to be dealt with in reality. So what we then did is we realised that to support the role of the principal designer, the principal contractor and the building safety manager was the need for some form of technical expert. We did make a mistake in the beginning to call it the lead engineer or the principal engineer, and we kind of realised that calling it the principal engineer did have a bit of a conflict with the CDM regulations. So we plumbed for lead engineer, and that's why one of our recommendations in the report is the creation of a role of the lead engineer to work from design, procurement, construction, testing, commissioning and into operations and maintenance, bringing with them all of that knowledge of how all the complex systems can integrate together. Does the fire alarm system work when it's going to need to? Does it bring the pumps on? Does the ventilation system work? And is it all going to be fine at that one moment in time when there's a fire in the building and all those systems have got to work together to keep people safe? So we then created the role of the lead engineer, which is part of our recommendations. The lead engineer will never be there to lead the other disciplines, the principal designer, the architect, the principal contractor, the building safety manager is there as a support role, bringing all the key technical knowledge right the way through the process. What we then worked on was to then looked at, obviously, the competencies, and my colleague Katie, who you heard from earlier, has done an immense amount of work on the competencies. Competencies are fine, competency schedules are fine, but making it real out there in real buildings is where it really counts. What we've got to do next in our group is we are planning on to do, this is the structure of where we're going to be going next. So we're going to look at further development of the safety case process in coordination with competencies. We're going to be looking at how do we actually monitor competencies, and we've just started looking at a competency monitoring and measurement process. We're very excited about it. It's a process that's come from somewhere else, and we're hopeful that that's going to work. The next thing we're going to look at is project management. Look at project management, right from design through to maintenance and operations. Our industry is not particularly great at putting together a coordinated, consolidated way of project management. So we've been discussing with an organisation called BISRA. Unfortunately, Julia Evans isn't here now, she's left, but she's the CEO. And they have a manual called a project management manual, which takes you across all those stages in a very structured way. And we've had a look at it, and we are very clear that we think that can be sensibly modified for HRRBs and taken into support and guidance for people on how to manage such buildings all the way through all the different stages. So that's the next stage we're going to be working on. And then another stage we're going to be looking at is much more detailed involvement in the procurement stage. Because one thing all of the working groups, including the procurement group itself, have identified is that procurement is so important. And I'll give you a thought. Speak louder, I'm told. Sorry, people. One of the things I would ask you, you want a car, you want a nice new shiny car. So you go to an engine supplier and you buy an engine, and you go to a body supplier and you buy a body, and you go to a wheel supplier and you buy some wheels, and a glass manufacturer and you buy some glass for your windows, and so on and so on. And then you say to all those manufacturers, I'm going to act as a project manager, and there's a garage sitting at the side of my house, come and build my car. Would you buy a car that way? Because that's the way a lot of buildings are put together. And that's the work that's going on now that's got to change. That's what's got to change. And how much time have I got left?
Just under 3 minutes.
Just under 3 minutes, okay. So one of the things that, excuse me, just to look up a little list of mine. One of the things that I want to coin now next with my team, and this is obviously going to work with the other working groups, is collaboration is absolutely critical in the built environment. We've got to work more collaboratively. Communication has got to be a lot better. Communication also equaling common language, because our industry still doesn't have common language. The next point is competency, and you've heard a lot about competency today, so I won't dwell on that. The next one that we look at is caring, and Dennis talked about this earlier, and also in the other groups we've talked a lot about this, is people care. What do I mean by people care? You can sit there as an architect, and I can sit there as an engineer, and we can care about what we do. But when you get out there in the world of maintenance, in the world of changing buildings once they've been built, with refurbishment works, and even in new build, getting the trades to care about each other's work is a real challenge. Imagine this, 2 tradespeople actually have a fallout, and the building's coming to completion, and all the testing's been done, and somebody's got a grudge, so they go around in the plant room and they cut the fire alarm cables. That's the sort of thing that actually happens. I've been on buildings where trade contractors have got a grudge, and they've gone down staircases putting greasy foot handprints all the way down the staircase, and every staircase has had to be repainted because they've got a grudge. You see the point I'm making about culture and behaviour? That's what really counts, is what happens out there. And in the maintenance world, you've got an even bigger problem, because your maintenance contractor changes time and time again, and within the maintenance contractor, the people change time and time again, and brings me right back to the safety case process of how we bring things together. So with 1 minute to go, what I'm just going to leave you with is just that one thought, is think about that model of how you buy a car relative to how you buy a building. Because that, to me, has been a challenge in our industry for many, many years, and we've never solved it. Thank you.
Mark Snelling. I'm going to put a different hat on than I had earlier on. I'm associated with project safety in this context. There seems to be nothing said on fire risk assessment, about fire risk assessment during the construction phase, where one would argue that in a complex building, the risk of fire is higher, the systems aren't complete. And there's nothing said about the competence of the fire risk assessor during that stage. Now, one would argue maybe it's not in within the aim, but I've got a Build UK contractor very proudly saying we're going to give our risk assessors 3 days training, and it just seems to be, it's an issue for me because I don't know what the standards should be.
Thank you. Dennis.
I didn't say it, but it was in the slide. I thought I made the point that it starts from the very beginning and runs right through a building, and clearly the construction phase is part of that process. And in fact, in CDM and in parts of the regulations, there's a requirement to have risk assessments. The point I was trying to make, and I'm sorry if it didn't come across, is that fire risk assessment is a process that should be continuous. It should be continuous from the idea, the concept, right until the day, as I think I said, they form a car park. So it is there and it should be there, but the point that's important is that when the concept was put forward, 2006, the government intent was that it shouldn't be a consultant's charter, it shouldn't be regulated, it shouldn't be controlled, and I think you're seeing the downside of that. And my argument is, and people in the working group, is that it should. I would also say we believe it should apply to all buildings. We do not understand a system that would only take out an in-scope group, because this country, in terms of its building industry, can't manage two forms of regulation, two forms of process.
Thanks. I've just had a quick point, and I mentioned it in mine. With regards to the safety case process, the part of the work we're going to be doing next with competency is to match all those competencies in the safety case process right the way through the whole stages of delivery. So that it definitely is exactly what Dennis said, but in terms of making it real, that's where we're going to be going next with the safety case process and competencies to match the two together. So the point you've raised can be then picked up.
Just to answer a point on that, there's a very big difference between a fire risk assessment, which is done in occupation, once the occupation starts, and being involved in. But I think it's very important that the fire risk assessor is going to take on the building, is involved in the start of the building, because you understand and see the building. You don't have to start cutting holes in to see what's been put behind it. But my question was really, the building safety manager, I mean, I've just written interview questions for a building safety manager for a housing organisation at the moment, and I wrote those questions around fire strategy to see if they knew the difference between what a building fire strategy was, what an evacuation strategy was. And for me personally, having seen a number of strategies at the start of a building process, when it's as built, when it's finished, then the fire strategy reflects completely nothing, and nobody does this is what you've now got, as opposed to this is what you started with strategy. When are we going to get those? And when are we going to put some pressure on 106 buildings that are handed over to give us more input as social landlords?
As I said, those in the audience who know me know this has been a bugbear of mine and some of the various other things I do. We need to define what these terms mean. A fire strategy, what's in it? A fire and emergency file, what's in it? So we all get exactly the same thing. So when you're a client buying something, you know what you're buying. If you're a supplier supplying it, you know what you should supply. And you know, to an element, we all know what these various documents and things should have in them, but we get so many different variations, and it's a very strong view of mine, a very strong view of a lot of people in working group A and elsewhere, is let's define in law, BSI or whatever it is, a number of these things. And I would put forward a fire strategy as one, various terms of fire risk assessment as another, right the way from the start to the end of it, maybe different terms. Fire and emergency files, you know, the list goes on, but what I'm saying is the definition of some of these things is urgently needed. And I concur with you entirely, because we get hundreds of different bits of paper, none of which necessarily correlate to anything very much, and frequently they don't reflect what's actually on the site anyway. So I'd concur with you.
Liz.
Hi, actually, Anthony, you need the mic back again, I'm afraid. Liz Mail. Wanted to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind. Could you tell us a little bit more about the role of the building safety manager in the responsibilities around residents' engagement, please?
Well, to be absolutely honest, we're still working that through, but I think the responsibilities of that must be to make sure that they are, you know, that we use the expression they are to be heard. We need to share much more information with them. And that comes back to the last question, is what information are we going to share? Because, I mean, a lot of residents wouldn't want the huge technical documents, but they do want to know they're there, and they do want synopsis of these things. Yeah, you can do. So I think it's a coordination role, but we also have to have their buy-in to the concepts of all this safety and fire safety, because if they don't allow us through the room when we need to check it, or if they continually, if the flats they live in have been built so small that they have to store stuff on the outside, which is blocking a fire exit, you know, it goes right the way back. We've got a load of big problems, but you know, to me, it's a liaison, but we can't do that on our own. We need to change the culture of the country, rather like drink, driving, clunk, click. It's now socially socially unacceptable to drink and drive. I mean, many years ago, it was a bit of a laugh to get away with it. Some people here in the audience may remember it, but we need to move that same sort of thing with fire safety. Does that partially answer?
I can just quickly add to you, having worked with 4 user groups, and 3 of them in particular had very much the point you raised at heart. How do you engage with the occupants? And training programs for the occupants are in place. Familiarisation, what is a fire strategy? What does it mean when the fire alarm goes off? How do you escape from the building? And these people are dealing with families, with all due respect to them, where maybe even language is a barrier. How do you communicate? Maybe having to put, and some of them I've seen putting up multi-language signs, but then the occupants can change frequently, so they've got to keep on top of it. And when we described the building safety manager role, it was very much as an enabler to make sure those things are happening, to make sure the engagement is there.
Okay, Andrew Bulmer, Institute of Residential Property Management. We do not see the building safety manager role being pulled in by the existing building manager. Now that's quite important because we're seeing salaries where the first BSMs are being recruited at about 65. Gentleman in the corner, 70, anyone give me 70. But the point is that that's quite a cost which is going to be absorbed by leaseholders, and there needs to be a plan put in place where leaseholders will be, will have that explained to them why it is that it's important, because otherwise the existing building managers are just going to get beaten up in terms of trying to present that on top of the existing service charge budget. We haven't seemed to have a discussion about the competence of the accountable person. Now, when residents own their own freehold and one of the well-meaning residents volunteers to be a director of their own little management company, and one of those becomes the accountable person, where does competence sit with that individual who will be accepting criminal liability for any number of different obligations?
Okay, could you just pass the microphone?
Hello, I'm Leslie McLeod from the Association for Project Safety. Mine isn't exactly a question, it's a point to make to Anthony. I don't disagree with you on the public information side, but I suspect the industry will be asked to pay for that. Public information films have not actually existed since the 1980s. I was the person responsible for the drink drive campaigns. Government has to pay for advertising just like everybody else now, and I suspect they won't do it. So the industry will probably be asked to cough up for it, that's all.
Quick.
And I quickly answer that. Yes, thank you. I would agree, but we have in our consultative document, we did go and see an advertising consultancy and suggested that they might help us, and they think it's actually worthwhile. But there is a value in there.
Oh, no, I agree with that. It's just, I think
But we just don't think it can't be done on our own. Coming to Andrew's comment, I mean, it is absolutely vital that these accountable people are. In that the view we've taken at the moment is, at this moment, for the buildings in scope, the big ones owned by the big companies, the big funds, the overseas investors and what have you, need to be tested for their fitness. When it's rolled out a bit further, then we're going to have to train and explain to people what their responsibilities are and how to manage them. I entirely agree with you.
Yeah, this is very quick. I know. I just wanted to make a very, very quick point. The resident is a key part of this process. And one of the great issues has been, how do we get messages across to residents who are constantly changing, constantly different languages, they're doing things, sometimes they're doing illegal things. And this is not new. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to get to here. We talked about responsible people, we talk about responsible persons. in existing legislation. We talk about Regulation 38 of handing over information. It has been ineffective, partly because it is not mandated in the way we feel it should be mandated. But if you don't engage the residents, how the hell do you get out of common areas and actually check the compartmentation of a flat or whatever? So it's got to be solved, it's got to be done. And if industry, if the leaseholder, if the resident has to start paying for that, if the local authority social housing has to start paying for that, it's going to happen. You can't have grandma changing the front door just because she doesn't like the look of the fire door. It's got to change.